Welcome to Audit the Audit, where we sort out the who and what and the right and wrong of police interactions. This episode covers public easements, identification laws, and trespassing, and is brought to us by the Delaware Defenders channel. Be sure to check out the description below and give them the credit that they deserve. On October 27, 2020, YouTuber and independent journalist known as the Delaware Defender, who I will refer to as Mr. Defender, was gathering content for an ongoing story about the health and food industry outside of the poultry processing plant Amick Farms in Hurlock, Maryland. Mr. Defender began recording at the northern entrance to the facility and was initially contacted by Officer Lee of the Hurlock Police Department. After a brief discussion, Officer Lee concluded that Mr. Defender was not doing anything illegal and left the scene without identifying Mr. Defender or discouraging his conduct. Once Officer Lee left the scene, Mr. Defender began making his way to the southern entrance when he was contacted by Sergeant Garby of the HPD.
What, did Lee not do a good enough job?
What's that?
Lee already responded out here.
You can't be on private property videotape.
What's that sticker say on it?
Yeah, that's Department of Transportation.
Well, yeah, the state of Maryland put this here.
Yeah, well this here is private property. This
Not where I'm standing, dude.
Yes, it is. You got an ID on you?
Let's go. Arrest me.
I'm telling you just to...
Arrest me. I'm not, because I'm not. This is a public street sign. Look at it. You're ridiculous. Lee was perfect. You just ruined it for you guys. You just ruined it. Garvey, you have a badge number?
Yeah, 0142.
Why did you ruin it?
You got an ID?
Lee, I'm not giving it to you. Yeah. I'm not trespassing.
Yeah, you're on private property, buddy.
This is a street sign.
Yeah, well, we're not playing
It's public property. I don't want to play it either. Arrest me.
I'm asking you for your identification.
Come on, I'm not going to resist you at all. I'm not giving it to you. I'll give it to you at the station. I want you to take it all the way. You think you're a bully, then let's take it all the way.
I'm not a bully. I'm seeing what you're doing. You're on private property.
I already told Lee what I was doing.
Well, you told me.
I'm not on private property. You need to go look at the map.
Well, I'm telling you, you're on private property.
How do you know?
This is the road. That's the land. That's private property.
There's this thing called an easement, right? Yeah. Because I don't have to walk in the street. I can walk here. That's why these signs are here.
Yeah. You're on private property. Videotape.
You hear this, dude?
What's that?
You hear this, dude? You were perfect. Why is he gonna ruin it for you guys?
He's not ruining nothing. You weren't on the property earlier, now you are.
I was in the same exact spot.
Hey, you were down the street.
Do you know what this is?
What's that?
A street sign.
Uh-huh.
They can't put their street signs on Amick Farms property.
Okay.
So this cannot be Amick Farms property because there is a Maryland sign here.
Here, Mr. Defender asserts the notion that because the city has placed street signs and utility poles along the roadway, that renders the land publicly accessible. However, publicly accessible lands are not always subject to First Amendment protections. It's important to draw a distinction between general easements and right-of-ways, because the protections associated with one may not always extend to the other. An easement is an agreement that grants an individual or municipality the right to use certain private property for a specific purpose. There are several different types of easements, and their functionality depends upon the agreement established when the easement was created. For example, easements may be either affirmative or negative, depending on their purpose. An affirmative easement gives the owner of the easement the right to use the land of another in a particular way, and a negative easement prevents an owner of land subject to the easement from using his or her land in a particular way. Easements may also be express or implied. An express easement is generally created by the execution of a deed or reservation recorded in the county's public records and must be in writing. Implied easements are created through a property owner's actions or inactions. If a property owner has consistently dedicated a portion of their land for others to use over the course of several years, then an implied easement generally exists. Right-of-ways are a specific type of easement that grants the owner of the easement the right to travel over another's property. Right-of-ways do not grant the public ownership of the property where an easement exists, and the existence of utility poles or government signage does not dictate where a right-of-way begins or ends. Contrary to popular belief, there are no universal rules or measurements for determining the location of a right-of-way, and the width of right-of-ways varies depending on road classification. As mentioned in many episodes of ATA, free speech is subject to certain limitations depending on the time, place, and manner in which the speech is expressed. The major hurdle facing First Amendment protections on right-of-ways is whether or not they are considered traditional public forums for expressive acts. and courts have done little to bring clarity to the subject. In the 1939 Supreme Court case of Hague versus Committee for Industrial Organization, the court famously noted that, quote, "Wherever the title of streets and parks may rest, they have immemorially been held in trust for use of the public, and, time out of mind, have been used for purposes of assembly, communicating thought between citizens, and discussing public questions. Such use of the streets and public places has, from ancient times, been a part of the privileges, immunities, rights, and liberties of citizens." Although this ruling affirmed the notion that public streets are protected under the First Amendment, it suggested that each forum should be considered on a case-by-case basis, and various circuit court rulings have concluded that defining a space as a public forum is highly circumstantial. For example, in the 1999 10th Circuit case of Hawkins versus City and County of Denver, the court held that a sidewalk in a performing arts complex was a non-public forum because it was only used by those visiting the complex. This ruling suggests that Mr. Defender may not have been in a protected forum because Amick Farms property is not generally open to the public. On the contrary, a district court within the 7th Circuit has specifically held that the shoulder of a highway is a traditional public forum on which picketing was allowed in the 1991 case of Jackson versus City of Markham, and based this conclusion on several rulings from both higher and lower courts. There are several other cases, both in the Supreme Court and lower courts, that tackle this issue, but the circumstantial variables at play significantly impact whether the forum is considered public. It is difficult to draw any rigid conclusions about whether Mr. Defender was in a public forum that enjoys First Amendment protections, and there are many factors which I have not explicitly mentioned here that would come into play. The point of this section is to highlight the fact that right-of-ways are not universal and are not always subject to First Amendment protections, and it is entirely possible for a court to find that Mr. Defender was not in a public forum at the time of this interaction. That said, there is equally a possibility that a court would find the opposite to be true, and without a court ruling on this interaction in particular, no legitimate conclusion can be made.
Come on, dude. Come on, Garvey.
One more time.
I'm not going to give it to you. I'll go. That's fine.
You got anything on you?
Not really, no.
Hands up.
I got a phone and keys and a water bottle. This is ridiculous, guys. You guys are a joke. Just a business card.
Delaware Defender.
That's me, brother. Why are you going in my pockets?
I haven't got anything on you, you said now.
Here, Sergeant Garby tells Mr. Defender that if he does not surrender his identification, then he will be arrested, and Mr. Defender continues to refuse. Maryland is one of the few states that does not have any laws which compel citizens to identify themselves to members of law enforcement. In most other states, citizens are required to identify themselves if an officer reasonably suspects them of committing a crime. But in Maryland, citizens are under no legal obligation to identify themselves unless they are driving. And citizens cannot be arrested solely for failing to present identification. In states with no failure to identify statute, it is common practice for officers to arrest citizens for obstruction of justice instead. But like most states, Maryland's obstruction code requires that a citizen obstruct an officer by threat, force, or corrupt means in order to be arrested. Outside of driving or lawful arrest, there are no circumstances in which Sergeant Garby could force Mr. Defender to identify himself. But the sergeant takes it a step further by conducting a search of Mr. Defender's pockets. As discussed on many episodes of ATA, officers may only conduct a warrantless search if they have probable cause to make an arrest. And even if Sergeant Garby had reasonable suspicion to detain Mr. Defender, that would not authorize him to search Mr. Defender's pockets. We will discuss whether Sergeant Garby had met the reasonable suspicion standard in a moment, but it is important to highlight that much of the sergeant's conduct during this interaction is based on Mr. Defender's refusal to identify himself, despite the fact that it is not illegal to do so.
What do you... I just told you. A strap.
Strap?
That's it. That's a lens cap. That might be the lens cap. Is it circular?
Phone?
Oh, then a phone, yeah.
So why are you making this difficult?
You're making it difficult. Lee was perfect. I'm not trespassing. You're ridiculous. I'll go to jail for it because you're full.
Okay.
There's no way that this is their property. It has a sticker on it because Maryland owns it. They don't stick it on other people's property.
You need to call the plant manager out here and tell you that you're on his property?
Get the property lines.
Right.
He's got no idea. Why are you listening to them? You're the police.
Yeah, I know.
You don't know. Clearly.
I'm
You have
telling
no
not to
idea.
get off the property.
I'm not on their property.
Buddy.
So you want me to stand in the street and get a ticket for...
Stand across the road.
That's their property too then.
That's a public road right there. That's a road.
So is this.
You're not on the road, you're on the grass. That's
Oh my
property.
God. You are ridiculous, Garvey.
Right.
You want me to go on the other side of the street?
And I'm gonna ask you one more time for your name.
I'm not giving it. I'll move.
You have a lawful order To give me your name.
You asked me to leave, I'm gonna leave.
I gave you a lawful order to give me your name.
Sergeant Garby orders Mr. Defender to leave the property, but then steps in front of Mr. Defender when he attempts to do so. It is clear that Sergeant Garby's purpose for being on scene is to issue a trespass warning to Mr. Defender, and at this point, Mr. Defender has not committed any crimes. Title 6, Subtitle 4 of Maryland's Criminal Code is entirely devoted to the crime of trespassing, and under these codes, an individual must be warned that they are trespassing before they can be arrested for committing the offense. Subsections 6-402 and 6-403 are the only codes that could apply in this interaction. Subsection 6-402 requires that the property be clearly marked with signage or paint marks, and subsection 6-403 requires that an individual be notified by the owner or the owner's agent that they are not welcome. There are no signs or markers in the area Mr. Defender was filming from, and no one asked Mr. Defender to leave until Sergeant Garby arrived on the scene. Mr. Defender has committed no crimes, and was attempting to obey the sergeant's order to leave the property before he was prevented from doing so. Not only did Sergeant Garby have no probable cause to arrest Mr. Defender and force him to identify himself, but no reasonable suspicion existed to detain Mr. Defender at all. If Mr. Defender had refused to leave the property, then he would have been subject to arrest. But that was not the case.
So what is your name?
Oh my God, I guess I'm going to jail today. That's fine.
What is your name?
I'm going to jail. It's fine. Let's go. I'm not giving it. I'm not trespassing. You can't arrest me for trespassing because I'm not trespassing. This is not their property.
It's not whose property is it?
It's an easement. It's county property, city property. It's city property. I do know. Well, I don't know if it's a county. Maybe it looks like a county road sign to me, but that's the junction for the road up there. That's why there's light poles here. They don't own the electric company. Come on, Garby. There's a public easement. It's probably 33 feet from the center line of the road, or 18.
One of those guys, are you?
Well, it's just facts.
What's your name?
I just want to go to jail, man.
You want to go to jail?
I guess, yeah, because this is just getting bad. Just because there isn't a paved piece of concrete here doesn't mean the same rules don't apply. I do this everywhere.
You do, yeah?
I do this all over the place. Typically Delaware, like you've seen, but the same laws apply.
State to state, they apply?
Well, easement laws, yeah. I mean, the feetage might be different, but I'm not even 2 feet off the road here.
You were right up here when I seen you.
I was standing right in line with this piece of wood, right? I mean, I got it on video. I'm still videoing now.
So am I.
That's great. So you really want it? You want to take me for trespassing now?
If I wanted to take you for trespassing, I'd take you. I'm asking.
So then what are you doing? So you're going to take me for failure to ID?
Yeah.
Well, what law am I breaking?
Failure to obey a lawful order. I've told you to give me your name.
Maryland is not a stop and ID state, Garby. You have to accuse me of a crime. That's the Fourth Amendment, just flat out.
One, you're trespassing.
I'm not. You just said I'm not trespassing.
No, I said I'm not locking you up right now for trespassing.
Why? I just said to. This is ridiculous.
After going back and forth, the sergeant eventually decides to arrest Mr. Defender and take him to jail. Mr. Defender was placed into a holding cell for approximately 20 minutes before being issued 2 citations and released. I recently spoke to Mr. Defender, and he informed me that he is still waiting for the citations to show up in the system over a month after this interaction occurred. He also told me that he is considering hiring an attorney, but is waiting to see if the citations will be entered into the court system before he takes further action. Overall, Sergeant Garby and Officer Lee get an F for displaying a fundamental misunderstanding of Maryland's identification laws, conducting a search without acquiring probable cause, and for arresting Mr. Defender when no crime had been committed. As Mr. Defender mentions, if the interaction had ended after Officer Lee's initial contact, then the Hurlock officers would likely have received an A+ for their conduct. But that was not the case. Sergeant Garby's entire purpose for contacting Mr. Defender was to issue a trespass warning and remove Mr. Defender from the property. Even if a court were to find that Mr. Defender was on private property and was not entitled to First Amendment protections, nothing about this encounter would have granted the sergeant the authority to detain and identify Mr. Defender. In order to be guilty of trespassing, Mr. Defender would have had to have been told to leave the property and refused to do so, but no one contacted Mr. Defender before the sergeant arrived on the scene, and the sergeant's contact effectively served as Mr. Defender's warning. The sergeant hinged Mr. Defender's arrest on his failure to identify himself, and as mentioned earlier in the episode, Mr. Defender was under no legal obligation to do so. Sergeant Garby turned what could have been a respectable and reasonable police interaction into an illegal arrest, and I sincerely hope that the Hurlock Police Department is able to correct the sergeant's conduct and educate him about Maryland's identification laws. Mr. Defender gets an A for remaining calm and cordial throughout the interaction, maintaining a balance between asserting his rights and complying with the sergeant's orders, and for engaging in a challenging but respectful dialogue with the officers. Although it is debatable whether Mr. Defender was on private property or not, there's a good chance that where he was standing would be considered an implied right-of-way. Unless Amick Farms trespasses every citizen who walks along the roadway, then there is significant merit to the notion that Mr. Defender had a right to film from that location. Mr. Defender was willing to compromise with the demands of the officers and move across the street, which would have accomplished the sergeant's purpose for being there, but the sergeant refused to allow him to comply. Nothing Mr. Defender did was criminal in nature, and his refusal to surrender his identification was valid. Although Mr. Defender was mistaken about the scope and nature of public right-of-ways and certainly could have invoked his right to remain silent more effectively, he did a fantastic job of challenging the logic of the officers and maintaining his innocence. I commend Mr. Defender for his conversational dexterity and constitutional awareness, and I highly recommend giving his channel your support. You can find a link in the description below. Let us know if there is an interaction or legal topic you would like us to discuss in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more police interaction content.